Substrate is a huge hot topic that I see discussed in arguments online and forums all the time. Quite a controversial subject in certain species and certain forums. The considerations we have to have when we are choosing a substrate are that it's safe, it's non-toxic, easy to clean. Some people would add in that it's affordable and cheap on that. Hygiene, really, we're confining these animals to a much smaller environment, much smaller area than it would be available to them in the wild. So naturally it's going to become more contaminated and more dirty and more soiled than in the wild. So they're coming into contact with more pathogens and things like that, so hygiene is an issue. And I guess the argument comes down to whether to use natural loose substrates or to use artificial or clinical substrates. And again, there are variations on this, and there's certain species that do very well on both. There's certain species that won't do well at all on one, and then there's a middle ground where the arguments and the debates arise. I would say that to minimize any risk, particularly with animals that are feeding from their substrate, I would prefer that loose substrate, particularly sand or particle substrate like wood chips and bark chips and things like that, I would prefer that they're avoided in animals that eat their food off the substrate itself. So an arboreal snake that's going to be fed by tongues, a rodent or something like that up in the branches, it's perfectly fine to have a deep litter with bark and kind of soil or compacted coconut fiber, things like that. It's perfectly fine to use that in an arboreal snake. But let's say the classic one of a bearded dragon kept on loose sand, you've got impaction risks there where that lizard is going to almost definitely ingest some of the loose substrate quite frequently over time. And there's a risk, especially if there's other gastrointestinal illness going on or an underlying parasitic infection, that the gut motility will be affected and that an impaction or an obstruction may develop, and that can be fatal without appropriate treatment. On the other side, you will get the argument that bearded dragons can be kept on sand absolutely fine for all of their lives without problems, and that is true for some people. But I think it requires a lot more thought. It definitely requires more space, and it requires very high attention to detail when it comes to their nutrition. Because if nutrition isn't good enough, the animal sometimes can start to deliberately ingest substrates, and that's an attempt to sort of to correct deficiencies in certain vitamins and minerals, particularly calcium. You see in the bottom left of the first picture bone-aid calci sand produced by certain reptile suppliers. I think calci sand is probably one of the worst marketed products in the reptile industry or in the reptile marketplace, because it's sort of excusing the idea that we should be allowing our animals to ingest their substrate as if that's normal behavior. Now in the wild, a little bit in certain species can be normal to aid digestion, but where you're encouraging or allowing an animal to ingest its substrate, I see it as almost an admission that your diet isn't right and you're not supplementing your animal or providing the right diet if it has to go and eat sand in order to correct its calcium deficiency. So I think that's an awful idea, and I think you need to definitely weigh up the pros and cons. But my rule would be that if it's an animal that eats quite a lot from the substrate, avoiding loose or particulate substrates is probably a good idea, because you could get away with it for 5 years, 10 years. You could have kept reptiles all your life and never had a problem, but it can cause a problem. And I do see it causing a problem from time to time. So in order to be risk-free, there's plenty of alternatives. You see in the second picture here that someone is using tiles for their, I think it's a leopard gecko enclosure. So there's a lot of alternatives like tiles, lino, pieces of slate, large pieces of natural substrates that can look very good, but the animal can't ingest in one piece. One of the tips that I always gave to bearded dragon owners that wanted to have a natural looking enclosure and didn't want to go down the route of using paper towels or lino or something like that was to use food grade bran, so powdered bran, which quite looks like sand, but if it's ingested it's digestible and it's not likely to cause an impaction. So there's ways around the aesthetics point of view of you know, having a naturalistic looking enclosure but using artificial or chemical substrates and avoiding the risks that some substrates can pose.